Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Julia Osman. I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this program. Joining me today, I have Dr. Judy Ridner, who's a professor of history at Mississippi State University. Hello, Judy.
Hi.
I'm also joined by Dr. Ann Marshall, who is also an associate professor of history at Mississippi State University. Hello, Ann.
Hello.
And I'm here also with Ms. Cynthia Thomas, who is a social studies teacher at Starkville High. Ms. Thomas, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone.
So this program is titled, from 1619 to 1776. And I thought I might take just a minute and introduce these projects to you and tell you all out there just a little bit about how we're organizing this particular presentation. So I'm an historian, and I'm not an historian of early American history, but I have noticed that over the years, there seemed to be some tension about what happened in early American history and what it means that these things happened in early American history. And just recently, these things seem to have been exemplified by both the 1619 Project and the 1776 Report. The 1619 Project consists of a team of journalists who got together to start adding essays to the New York Times, beginning on August 14th, 1619, which is when the first enslaved Africans arrived on what would someday be American soil in 1619. And so the goal of this project of gathering together these various essays was to try to reframe the American story with the African American story at the center. And so these various essays tried to do this. The 1776 report came out at the end of the Trump presidency at the very beginning of January. And the 1776 report was commissioned to try to make a definitive statement about American history. And that definitive statement condemned social justice, it condemned universities, and it campaigned that American history should be taught a certain way, specifically to instill love of America into students, K through 12 students in universities, and to help them be good citizens. So I thought that these two projects were interesting to look at the same time, or were interesting examples of this battle for American history, because they both projects came out about the same time. 1619 project came out in 2019. The 1776 report came out in 2020. Both projects were authored by non-historians. The 1619 project was authored mostly by journalists. The 1776 report seems to be authored mostly by politicians, including Phil Bryant, who was recently governor of the state of Mississippi. Both were written not just about history, but definitely with an eye to the present. Both seem to have a number of inaccuracies, and both garnered some criticism from historians over the accuracies of the statements that they made. And both seem to have a real emphasis on what was taught in K through 12 schools. So the 1619 project has lesson plans that you can use to help recenter the history you're teaching around the African-American experience. And the 1776 report evokes certain values and heroes and stories that it thinks should be the crux of K through 12 education. And then both projects seem to have a lot of resonance through right now. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have this program was because of Senate Bill 2538, which was here in Mississippi, and it was called the Saving American History in Mississippi Schools Act. And that act would have prevented funds from being used to teach the 1619 project. So that, shows what an impact the 1619 project had. Now, that bill died in committee, so it's no longer active. It's no longer at risk of being put into law, but it shows the power of the 1619 project. At the same time, Governor Tate Reeves put money in the budget for this upcoming year for the Patriotic Education Fund, which he says needs to be used to help schools teach patriotism. And he says, and this is a quote from the budget proposal, young children have suffered from indoctrination in far left socialist teachings that emphasize America's shortcomings over the exceptional achievements of this country. And that is coming almost right out of the 1776 report. So both the 1619 project and the 1776 report seem to have ripples into the modern day. And so what I thought I would do is I would talk to some actual historians and a history teacher who is teaching in the K through 12 system and see what they thought, not necessarily just about these two things, but kind of about this larger tension about how American history is taught and what American history means. So Dr. Judy Ridner is an historian of early American history. She studies the colonial and revolutionary period. And she also has worked with the public an awful lot, especially with an oral history called Shaky Truce about the Civil Rights Act in Starkville, Mississippi. Dr. Ann Marshall is an historian of the Civil War, also knows an awful lot about American history, and has also worked a good deal with the public, especially recently talking about issues concerning Confederate monuments. And Ms. Thomas has been teaching in Starkville at Starkville High School now for 6 going on 7 years and teaches 11th graders American history. So she is in the middle of what both of these projects are kind of talking about and where a lot of this tension is. So first of all, to those of you who are joining me right now, thank you so much for joining me and for being willing to talk about this. And I'll also just add one more thing before we dive in, and that is for all of those of you who are listening and who are with us watching and taking in this program, we value and we ask for your input. So if you have any questions for the presenters as we're talking about these things, please don't hesitate to put those in the Facebook comments below this video, and I will be sure to ask them or include them in the conversation. So please do that as we go. Just to get us started and to get the conversation started, do any of you here want to talk more about the 1619 project or the 1776 report in terms of history and how you teach it? Were any of you inspired to respond to these things, either in terms of changing how or what you taught?
I'm not sure. Well, maybe I'll go because I haven't been teaching this year, so that I can't really talk about teaching it because I've been on a leave this year. But I'll volunteer since I'm the early Americanist, so we'll do some sort of chronological thing. I think that these 2 reports really challenge us in different sorts of ways. And I'll be honest, I have mixed feelings about both of the reports. I have very strong feelings about one of them, and I have mixed feelings about the other. I think, as you said, Julia, they are both very presentist in a lot of their underlying assumptions and their underlying agendas. The 1776 report is blatantly presentist and very geared towards advancing a blatantly conservative political agenda at the expense of scholarship. The 1619 project, though, also has a very clear political agenda and is oriented towards a lot of presentist kinds of questions and issues. Now, racism, clearly, one of the things that the project's trying to do is point out that racism is something that goes back to the foundings of our country. So it is a present day issue, but it is also an issue that extends back into the 17th century and the Jamestown settlement. But what's really interesting to me about the 1619 project is how little time it spends actually dealing with and delving into the history of colonial America in particular. So it certainly posits 1619 and thus early stages of the Jamestown colony as this pivotal moment, the founding moment in American history, when 20 enslaved Africans are unloaded upon the shores of this struggling colony. But then it mostly kind of skips forward to the Revolutionary period and then very quickly moves on into the 19th and the 20th century. And so really then, I would argue, as some other early American historians have argued, that it is motivated by like political agendas that I am very sympathetic with, and motivated by social agendas that I'm very sympathetic with. But it also ignores a large body of scholarship by early American historians who have been talking about the history of slavery from the founding of our country. And they've also been putting it in a much broader context, talking about the age of discovery, for instance. I mean, we didn't invent slavery. That was being invented by the Spanish and Portuguese, during the early 1500s, race-based slavery. And so the 1619 Project is maybe not as fully in conversation with this scholarship as it might be. So I have found it like it has the potential to be a launching point for some conversations, but I will tell you, if anything, maybe what it should do is encourage people like me to start doing more, to teach more of this scholarship that's been done on the colonial and revolutionary period, that really has talked about the complex kind of ins and outs of slavery and race in early America, meaning really before 1800. So that might be a way to launch conversation.
Thank you for that, Judy. I mean, it's really interesting because I don't know anything about these time periods, so it's really interesting to hear your take on it as an historian who does. And I have a few follow-up questions, but I'm gonna look at Anne and Ms. Thomas first and just see if either of you have thoughts you want to share on this as well.
Yeah, sure. I'll go on and sort of, I think first Judy left us to say I completely agree that both of these projects are very presentist in nature. But as somebody who I spend a lot of time studying historical memory, or the way that people remember history, and I think that these projects are really indicative of the way that we think about history, remember history, teach history, tell history, is always about the present, always, always, always. And that's why it changes over time. That's why the way that we, the stories that we tell and the narratives that we include, those change over time. So I sort of see this debate we're talking about today, where clearly the 1776 project is definitely a response to the 1619 project and this effort to reframe the narrative, and they want to go back to this other narrative. And the idea that there has been this longstanding idea in American history that we should just have one narrative, that we all have a common history, and that's very much running through the 1776 project. But this has been the case for for over 100 years, that Americans have thought, especially when it comes to educating young people, that we need to have this idea of consensus, right? That there is, and it's been a tool that that educators have used. I mean, there's a reason that social studies and history classes were oftentimes called civics classes, throughout the 20th century, because it was a way to sort of Americanize people, right? To create loyal, patriotic citizens, and to diminish any kind of dissent in a nation that has had, we're famous for being sort of polyglot, right? We're a melting pot. And one of the ways that authorities and educators have tried to melt people together have been to sort of outline this familiar, this history that's familiar to us, but this idea that there is this one American experience, and the curriculum tends to focus on, the founding and the founding fathers and these founding documents as ideals. And so that's happened all throughout the 20th century, when you have, waves of immigration, you have the communist scares, both after World War I and during after World War II. So we can see this, I think, as just a continuum of that kind of, of that kind of tension, I think. And what this 1619 project is doing, and what lots of history since the 1960s has done is sort of called out and said, no, wait, that, it's not just that we have these politics of today, but it's that the history that you're telling us that we all shared. Well, we didn't all experience those events the same way, right? The Declaration of Independence probably rang hollow if you were an enslaved person, in the 1770s, right? So I think that this is like sort of the latest chapter in sort of long history of this. But it is interesting. I think that Mississippi was one of, I think, 3 states that tried to really clamp down on this, and there were bills in the state legislature. I think it was Arkansas and Iowa also had these bills, and it's really a way, it points to the fact that a lot of this education takes place, the control over what education contains takes, really is legislated by at the state level. So, which I know, probably Miss Thomas can certainly speak to that, I think.
Oh, yes. I mean, we had a conversation, earlier, last week about curriculum, what's being taught, what can be taught. And I, mentioned how one of with the election, this year, very, interesting, election. Students, were ready. I mean, they were ready. They wanted to talk about it. However, I had to, tell them, we can't, talk about the political, the politics aspect, of what's going on, in the state or in the country. And that just does not make sense to me. If when we're talking about rigor and relevance, in the classroom, that was the most opportune time, for those students, to present their thoughts on the process, of the president, what was going on, in the country, how they felt. So all of that had to be, shut down. We couldn't talk about it. We had to, let's say, stay on course and pretty much, let's say, talk about at the time, immigration. So it's very hard and difficult, especially when we're being told we can't talk about politics in the classroom, but yet everything is being driven by politics. That's what, I'm like, how can we not bring politics is the driving force behind everything. So, it's like we're in a conundrum. And 76 report said it's the state and local government that determines, what can be taught, in these schools. So we have to, look to them or bring our voices or opinions to the table to let them know, this is very important. And look at the 1776 report and this 1619 project. It's like they're both necessary evils, I guess. It's like a paradox. What's in the 1776 report? Okay, I get that. 1619, we're looking at, the impact that slavery had on the shaping of America. And so for the most part, both of these are paradoxes, yet both are tied to our American history.
Thanks so much, Ms. Thomas. I mean, I think both you and Dr. Marshall have just pointed out, this really kind of this real tension that has existed, as Anne pointed out, for a very long time, using American history to try to teach us who we are and how we're supposed to be. But at the same time, you can't acknowledge the forces that are requiring us to teach it a certain way, right? Which limits the conversation a lot. And we have some questions coming in and some fabulous comments on our Facebook page. But if we could just back up 1 second and I'll jump into those. But I was wondering if we could kind of establish why does history have to be so political? I mean, history is made of facts, right? Why can't we just say the facts and it doesn't have to be Republican or Democrat or left or right? Why can't we just say the facts? So what is it about history that has this relationship with the political?
I don't know if it's, with history, That's what I love about it. And I think that's our issue with history. We don't really want to face, I guess, and address, history. This is what happened. We want to shy away from, I guess, the dark days, in our history. We want to, let's say, ignore that, but we cannot do that. And cannot talk about one without the other. One didn't happen, that's for instance, slavery. A lot of us, especially, it goes back to curriculum, with slavery. It's only so much you can talk about, why? Why is there, a limit? Why is there just certain content or information that we can, present or discuss? So for, with history, I think that's what it is. It's the truth. Some of, facing the truth, with our history, there are some truths that, all of us, there are some things, like we want to deny or we want to pretend that it didn't happen. But the fact of the matter is it did. We should be able to, discuss it amongst ourselves, as, citizens of this country, as human beings. And like I tell my students, everybody is entitled to their opinion, and we should be able, all of us should be able to agree to disagree. I think that's where, we're falling short. I may disagree, let's say the 1619 project, I may disagree with some of the concepts in there, but, that's my opinion, but I'm not going to prevent you, from pushing this project, through. There are, there is an argument with the 1619 is ideology, versus, facts. And so if that is the case, so why not, as historians, let's, get together. So what is fact? What is fiction? With these organizations, with historians, with teachers, with the government for that matter. Because again, it goes back to the leaders, of our country. It goes back to the leaders of these states, what we will be able and will not be able to do when it comes to, let's say, taking, a trip back down memory lane to talk about, how this country came to be, why, or, we still have issues, let's say from, stemming from 1865, fast forward to 2021, some of those issues, still resonate in our society today. And it goes back to having healthy conversations. We must be able, just meet it head on instead of trying to ignore it and pretend that it didn't happen. And I think once we're able to do that, we will, get better. The students will be, our kids will be more informed. So again, that's just my opinion when it comes to history. We tend to shy away from the truth.
Yeah,
I think, yeah. Go ahead, Judy. Yeah.
so I think too, to follow up on what Ms. Thomas said, and what Ann said, history is always tied to ideologies, to political ideologies, and to the construction of nationalism and national identities. And as Ann pointed out too, I mean, and Julia, you would know from your own work, I mean, all nations have sort of constructed identities, national identities, and who controls the history can try to at least claim that they control those national identities. But in the United States, that national identity construction is especially fraught, as Ann noted, because we are a nation of immigrants. So we really don't have necessarily a common language, a common ethnic or racial background, a common sense of being a people. We really are constructing it from the ground up. And history is one of those things that's supposed to be helping us do it. And as Ann noted before, I think very astutely, we've been fighting over whether or not there has to be one narrative or multiple, or if there can be multiple narratives of American history for a long time. This is indeed, I would agree with her, this is indeed the most recent iteration of a long-standing conversation that goes back, well, I guess you could argue even into the kind of late 19th, early 20s, even to the time right after the revolution. There's a conversation about what kind of history we're going to tell about the event, about this war we just fought. So it's a long-standing battle, and there's a lot at stake because it's so closely tied to our politics and our sense of ourselves.
Yeah, I think if I can just jump in to follow up, I think I think the people who have shaped the way that history has been taught, as a civics project rather than as academics try to approach it as a sort of objective, somewhat of an objective science. That's a whole other conversation. But because that people have been taught to revere people in the historical past, it's really made it hard for the American members of the American public to be objective, right? And to sort of, I think I always say, like, second to sort of religion, people are really invested in their history, right? And oftentimes they approach it with the same kind of attitude where they're looking for heroes, right? They're looking for role models. They're looking for perfect people. And as I, oftentimes tell my students, there are, you've got Hitler and you've got Mother Teresa, but most people in the past fell somewhere in the middle, right? They're not all good and they're not all bad. And so I think, when I try to teach with that in mind. But it is hard, I think, for people to wrap their heads around. So they tend to think that people who are trying to be objective and trying to hit the hard stuff are just trying to, knock their heroes off their pedestals. And I think that's a mischaracterization of what most of us are trying to do.
Yeah.
So if I could just give an example of, I think, what y'all have been talking about with the relationship between history and identity, and then I promise everyone on Facebook we're going to start with those questions because they're building up. But just to kind of illustrate this point, in one of the first essays for the 1619 project, Nicole Hannah Holmes says, and I'm just going to stitch a few sentences of hers together here. She said, "I had been taught in school through cultural osmosis that the flag wasn't really ours, that our history as a people began with enslavement, and that we had contributed little to this great nation." And then she goes on a little further and she says that her father knew that our people's contributions to building the richest and most powerful nation in the world were indelible, that the United States simply would not exist without us. And then she takes that one step further and she says, Black Americans have also been and continue to be foundational to the idea of American freedom. More than any other group in this country's history, we have served generation after generation in an overlooked but vital role. It is we who have been the perfecters of this democracy. So I think it's just a great illustration, coming from one of the things I noticed to start this project off in the first place, of how closely people want to see themselves in their own history in a certain way, right? And in a way that's not wrong. So, but with that though, I'm gonna jump to our first question if I can. And this first question is just kind of throw another fun thing to talk about into the mix, because we've been talking about the 1776 report and the 1619 project. But here's a good point from Lydia Carrillo. She says, "My problem with the 1619 project and many historians is that they start U.S. history in Jamestown. To me, this is an obvious political choice rather than a historical argument. History of the U.S. started much sooner. There were people already here, and ignoring that is a huge oversight. I want to know the thoughts of this. I want to know the thoughts of the presenters on this, if possible." And Judy, I can already tell that you have a thought to share.
Well, I think I already gave revealed my hand on this. I think that this is, again, my sympathies are with the 1619 report and what it's calling on us to, the kind of rethinking it's calling on us to do. The historian in me says it has problems, because I would agree with Lydia that where are the Native Americans in this story? And again, where is that history before 1619? The English just don't appear here in 1607 as, the only people here in the Americas. they come armed with attitudes about Native Americans and about Africans that they have gleaned from other Europeans who have already been here and who have been writing about their experiences and publishing about their experiences and distributing those publications around Europe in the 16th and the very beginning of the 17th century. So I am sympathetic to that. I think that there is, again, it's because I think, as Anne rightly said, we ask questions that are relevant to us today. And the question relevant to a lot of African Americans today is, what about 1619? And that makes sense. But again, the historian's hat that I wear is also looking at a broader history where, again, we got to put African Americans and African experience in conversation with other experiences, including those of Native Americans, and the English experience in conversation with the experience of other Europeans, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch. So I'm sure others have things to say as well.
They do. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read a comment again from the comments that speaks just to what you were saying, Judy. This is a comment from Deidre Payne, who says, all of life is political. The history of this country that existed before the Europeans arrived on these shores has also been excluded, just like you were saying, Judy, except for the telling of hero John Smith and the adoringly helpful Pocahontas. The tension that exists is the result of mythologizing of American history to exclude both the natives who are already here and those enslaved and forced here. Prior scholarship carefully crafted a tale of American exceptionalism that was solely Western European. That scholarship excluded the contributions made to this country through the rape and robbery of the African continent of its natural resources, human and mineral. All of life is political. No explorer left Europe without the government's prompting. So I will just throw that into the mix as someone who's also thinking along similar lines. There's another, and there are lots of comments going on at the same time, and I'm not going to be able to read them all quite in time. But here was another question that came up. This is a question from Jill Cooksey, and she says, she is also a history teacher. And she says, one discouraging factor I face when teaching is addressing current legislative decisions that do not reflect progress. My students express this. They ask why. One student even said, why is the older generation still fighting the Civil War?
Wow, that's a good one.
That's a good question. So I don't know, Anne or Ms. Thomas, I don't know if either of you have thoughts on this, and you look at the memory of the Civil War.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, and that might be more like a metaphor for just the lack of, trying to repeat the same historical arguments. But yeah, I mean, I do think that that is a really important point. And I think both in, like Ms. Thomas was talking about earlier, where her students want to talk about these issues, right? Because they're living them. And our college students as well, it is really just sort of paternalistic of the, and now I'm saying this as a middle-aged woman, but, as people who are trying to control education, right? And, to think that somehow if we don't offer a particular history, like if we avoid certain kinds of history, that students are just not going to notice. I mean, they're smarter than that, right? They're more aware of the world, I think, than we oftentimes give them credit for. And yeah, in terms of progress, I mean, I think progress is, we tend to try to think that progress is this sort of like, line that just kind of, this trajectory that just keeps kind of going. And I think most historians don't think that way. We know that, there are ebbs and peaks and valleys, I guess you might say. So, yeah, that, there's always going to be, for what one person sees as progress, another person might think is terrible. And so there's going to be backlash. So, I think, there are this sort of cycles that, that go on. So.
One person's progress is another person's catastrophe. And I do feel like sometimes we're a bit on a pendulum a little bit in not just in history, but in how it's taught.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Thomas, did you want to jump in? do your students tend to pick up on this kind of we're fighting the Civil War all over again mentality, or are your students aware of, these kinds of calls to teach history in very different ways?
Yes, I mean, it comes out when basically when, they want to have the conversation, but when they find, I have to tell them that, we can't talk about that, and pretty much, have to end the conversation then and there. So yes, they are aware what's going on, in this country. And yes, they do. They want to, talk about it. They want to discuss it. But when you're pigeonholed as teachers, as certain things, we can talk. It goes back to again. There are certain things we can talk about, certain things we, cannot. So when you're pigeonholed, that's what happens. And so for those, those students, I'm like, hopefully, they'll get or they'll seek or find what they want to know. Maybe, when they go to college, they can have that conversation that they could not have in high school. So, that again, it's like a slippery slope when it comes, to education, and I feel like, we're doing a disservice again, because this is the 21st century. These students, oh my goodness. So when you have those opportunities, those opportunities like that, to have that healthy, conversation where they're actually thinking outside the box, thinking about, what's going on in the world. So, and to have, to tell them like, we can't talk about that, but you can talk to your parents, about that. So that's pretty, where I'm at, with that. So hopefully, it may change in the future. Sometimes I go off the grid. I do go off the grid in the classroom, but it's a line I don't cross. I have to be ever mindful of that invisible line that I can't cross.
Right. Well, and it's interesting too, you talk about parents, and a lot of people I think do get history from their parents. And I think Ms. Thomas, you, and I know Anne, Judy, and I, we can all talk about, what happens if you're presenting something to a student that is not the same as what their uncle told them when they were growing up or something. But you also, Ms. Thomas, were talking about that line. Oh, Judy, did you want to jump in? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just thinking off of what you're saying, that it's also interesting to think about how things like ancestry.com are changing the way we are conceiving of history, and whether or not it's changing. Because I mean, if you've had your DNA done, I mean, one of the things that's been written about a lot is how DNA analysis is revealing that a lot of us are more multiracial than we thought. It's also the number of scanned documents mean that you can trace the history of not just men, but also women. There's more and more information online about African Americans. It's still, disproportionately geared towards white people, but again, it's changing by the day. And it's also interesting to think then maybe that will give people a different sense of history, because I think, as other people have said, history is so very personal too. And so this is maybe changing the way we are thinking about our personal histories, and allowing us to do more to put our family's history into a broader context that might then dissipate some of the fear. I think, you asked the question originally, Bill's question about what's it with the Civil War? Or do people have such fear about giving up interpretations of his, and I think it speaks to you too, Cynthia, to some of what you've said, that, why is it that people are so afraid to talk about some things? What is it that they're going to lose? What's at stake? So.
Well, and I also think, the case of the Civil War is also an interesting one to talk about, state and local government being the place where these decisions about what gets taught and doesn't get taught get made. I think we're all familiar with the debates and the role of Confederate memorialists and putting up monuments, but I'd say that by far their most influential thing that they did was to censor textbooks in southern states. All these UDC chapters around the South, petitioned to get certain textbooks that, had interpretations that didn't align with theirs, whether it be about slavery or whether it be about, what caused the Civil War. And so what ends up happening is you get all these textbooks starting in the early 20th century that all talk about, it was an issue of states' rights, and actually slavery wasn't that bad. And so when these are the approved textbooks, these are, this has informed the generations of students in southern states. And so I think that's in part why older people, whatever that means, have a hard time, letting go of, or they're still fighting the Civil War, because really, that kind of education, that kind of history education has had a very, very long sort of afterlife, and is still, we still get students in our classrooms at Mississippi State that carry some of these same beliefs because that's what they've been taught. So.
Well, kind of on that theme, there's a number of questions that are kind of pointing towards the same things, which is kind of about balance. And they're saying, well, can't we teach something in between the 1619 report or the 1619 project and the 1776 report? This is part of a question from Jill Cooksey and also from Katie Collier. Can we teach both perspectives from these things and everything in between? Is there a way to achieve some kind of magical political identity balance in the way that we describe history to students?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Cynthia. What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
Oh no, teaching, can it be done? I think it can be. We must work at it. But can it be done? Yes, it can be done. So that's my opinion, on that. Can we teach, or convey both, perspectives? So again, when we talk about, people living back in the Civil War, and again, when it has been ingrained into you, since, let's say, childhood, again, it is hard, for people, to let go or forget of their ideologies or their beliefs. I get that, myself, I'm not asking anyone, to give up, their ideology. This is what you believe. This is your belief. Okay. I respect that. But, can we not, again, be able to, discuss your perspective plus, a perspective that, is in direct conflict, with yours. So again, yes, I think we can teach both perspectives. I think we'll get a better understanding, on what's, the history of America if we do.
Anne?
Yeah, so I was going to say, actually, when I was reading the 1976 project, I disagree with many aspects of it, but it did strike me. I'm teaching an intro to early U.S. history this semester, and it struck me that, my interpretation may be different, but I am still teaching a sort of, it's at least a half top down, what we call top down class, right? Like I have a day on Jefferson's vision of the expanding United States and Hamilton's vision of, so it's, I do still center quite a bit of my class around these sort of, great, so-called great white men, right? Because they're ideas were so influential, right? And they weren't theirs alone. They just informed so much of the development of the country. And we'd be losing a lot of history if we did not discuss that. But I think, I also, center a lot of what I teach also on the history and the experiences of people who were not, elite and were, might be among the oppressed people, right? So, I don't think, I think it is, wrong to sort of think about like a Democrat, perspective, or a Republican perspective, or a let's center these people. It's really about, I think, talking about multiple historical perspectives and multiple historical experiences. And so I think, to me, I don't know if that's what I would say is a balanced approach, because that's not really what I'm looking for. I'm trying to teach a history that accurately reflects the experiences of Americans, plural. That's what I'm going in for. Not, I'm not trying to think about, I'm not carrying an agenda. If I have an agenda, that's it. It's like multiple experiences. And so that involves lots of different types of people. So I think, I don't know if that's what people mean by balanced, because people are going to hear what they want to hear, and they're going to receive what I tell them, how they're going to receive it. But that's the way I approach it.
I'll follow up just a little bit. Sometimes though, I like to push buttons just a little bit, because I think some buttons need to be pushed. And it's been interesting, I taught in the North for a long time. I am a Northerner. It's been interesting to come to the South and teach. When I taught in the North, I had stopped teaching, and I'm thinking again here about the US survey class. I had stopped teaching Frederick Douglass's narrative because everybody read it. Everybody knew it. They read it in high school. And it's been really interesting. I've started teaching it again here and in the US survey classes. And so nobody's read it. And some students are absolutely astounded to read that narrative, because of course it's, in certain respects, the perfect narrative to teach, because it makes all of these emotional, it tugs at the emotional heartstrings, because it was an abolitionist text. And here's this man telling, a runaway slave, telling his story. There he is, ultimately, somebody who became one of the most influential figures in 19th century US history. And he tells this incredibly powerful story of his life and his family's lives. So sometimes I like to push on them, but like Anne, it's not with the intention of necessarily converting them. What I think we all try to do is present evidence that may be contrary to those assumptions that they come in with, that they have from those textbooks that are written with a certain political slant, and just try to give them some things to start weighing other perspectives. And I'm sure Anne teaches also how do you deal with secession in Mississippi, where everybody thinks, oh, it's states' rights. Well, go look at the Mississippi secession document, where they blatantly say it was about slavery. This is a war over slavery. And students sometimes don't want to read that, but it is a way to just push a few buttons to get them to reconsider. And I don't necessarily, and I've said in US survey classes, I don't expect to convert you, to my vision of history, which is a fairly inclusive one, like Anne's, like Ms. Thomas's. But I do want you to at least consider why you believe what you believe, and I want you to see contrary evidence. And do I get any converts? Probably not, but at least they're forced to reckon with some evidence that is contrary to their perspective. So,
Well, speaking of reckoning, I've got a question and a comment on the feed that might require us historians to reckon a little bit, at least. And I'd like to hear your response to it. This is another question from Deidre Payne, and she says, why did white historians not question the absence of Native American history beyond Pocahontas or Sitting Bull, the big figures, etc., before now? Why is the pushback so vehement now that a Black scholar has entered the discussion? Natives have tried to tell their story and claim their rights. They were massacred, shoved onto dry land, and demonized. Where were the historians then? Now that a Black woman is speaking up, the questions from white historians are just disingenuous and laughable. So I don't know that historians haven't talked about Native American history before now, but I do want to kind of get at this idea of how are historians, what are we responding to, and where are we needing to do better, or things like that. So do you have any response to Deidre's question, Ms. Payne's question?
well, Julie, I would say, I think you answered it. I mean, there's been an extensive, voluminous scholarship on Native Americans especially, and I speak mostly about early America, but it goes on into the 19th century and the 20th century. I mean, it's one of the major fields in early American history. And believe me, the histories that are being written are not like anti-Native American. They are being written from a Native American, a Native-centric perspective, an Indigenous-centric perspective. So I think that's out there. And I would just, encourage the questioner to contact one of us, ask for some bibliography, take one of our classes. I think you'd find that there's a lot of Native American history that's very sympathetic to the Indigenous perspective.
Anne?
Yeah, I mean, and I would say agree with Judy. I would also say that again, things are, the sort of impetus behind moments where we reframe history or bring in narratives where we haven't before. A lot of times, almost always, has to do with what's going on in the present. And so, I think the first sort of the efforts of historians and other scholars to seriously, question these traditional narratives of African American history, of Native American history, come out of the 60s with the civil rights movement. And so that's where it starts. But I would say, there hasn't been as much, there hasn't been as much attention paid to the current plight, the current issues, the current, that are happening today amongst Native Americans. I mean, yes, we've got, Standing Rock, we've got things like that, but the average American is going to see what's going on in the news in terms of, police violence towards African Americans, and they're going to understand that more easily than what's going on with an oil pipeline going through Native American territory. And so I'm not trying to write that off at all. I'm saying I think that there are real points where the public becomes invested and starts to become invested and sympathetic to different kinds of different historical narratives based on what they see, the oppression that they see happening in the present. And so I think that may be why we have a sense that the popular conception of Native American history isn't where it should be. But Judy's absolutely right. There's a lot of academic scholarship. We just need to bring it to the fore.
We need the government to bring it to the fore so that Ms. Thomas can teach more of it in her class.
Yeah, it's okay to teach.
Yeah. So, and that gets to the comment that, and I'm sorry if I cut you off, Anne, but that gets to the comment that I was also trying to get to on our Facebook feed. Bessie Brown says the way that history has been taught has been based on sociology, economic levels, or what is legislative, pertinent events of the time. And she wants us to talk more about this. So I think what she's getting at there is how much, what is taught is not really related to what historians are actually doing. Is it? It's related to legislatively, economically, sociologically, what's going on in the immediate present, not necessarily the scholarship that we're producing.
Right, which raises some really interesting questions. And I think Anne was sort of hinting at this in some of her comments, that for whatever reasons, we have been poor communicators in terms of, notice how it's taken discussion over these two projects that involve very few historians, 1619 written primarily by journalists, with consultation with a couple of historians, one historian writing for it, a sociologist, but mostly journalists. And then the 1776 report, which had no historians involved whatsoever. And so somehow we have been poor communicators in terms of getting out there and communicating the fact that we have been working on all of these fields for a long time. And we are, we're very sympathetic to the perspectives offered in the 1619 project. And so now, how do we reconcile it? I don't know. It will be interesting to see if we see some reconciliation because of this pandemic, because of programs like this that can be held over Zoom. Lots of people can participate in them. They're free. And so suddenly historians can have some communication. Teachers, public school teachers can have some communication directly with the public. But clearly, as a profession, we have partly failed in reaching beyond the academy. And it's one of the things that I think is one of the major challenges we now face as a profession, in my own opinion.
Yeah, I agree with Judy. I think, I think we can look, there was a moment this several books on history of racism, sociology of racism that were on the New York Times bestseller list. I mean, the American public is receptive to these ideas, but I think we have to do better at presenting them to the public in a way. If we all wrote like Ibram X. Kendi, then
Right.
we would be who writes these large books, but they're readable, they're understandable for the general public. And I think we all need to do, we need to do better on that, because people do want to think about these things and read about them.
And this is a great follow-up question to what we were saying. This is from Sally Hatch Gray, who says, why can't we have experts write the textbooks? Why are most textbooks written not by experts or historians or people who know what's going on, but by people who maybe have a stronger background in education as a field, or who are elected officials? Or why are the textbooks written to please elected officials in certain states? I've always asked this question, why aren't we writing textbooks? I don't know if we have a good answer for that.
Well, it's all about selling, I think Anne hinted at this before, and Ms. Thomas has hinted at this as well. I mean, they're approved by state boards that often do not include historians and have certain political perspectives and political agendas. And the result is that even if scholars are writing textbooks for elementary and middle school and high school, they are clearly being advised to write them in certain ways, because the textbook companies have to sell those books to these state boards. And, years ago, I was a reviewer on a middle school textbook that was by one of the big publishers. And I just looked at the early American chapters. They were basically the 1776 report. I mean, it really was. This is 15 years ago. You'd never know that Native Americans were only mentioned when they waged war on whites. African Americans were mentioned almost not at all. This was a great mythologized history of white people who had stepped off the boat in Plymouth as Democrats, and had the founding of the American Republic was basically set in stone in 1620. It was just all foreordained. And writing a critical critique of it clearly did nothing, because they just there's a process you go through where, sure, I wrote this scathing critique, but the textbook got published pretty much as is, and probably got sold in the state of Texas, where the big money is. So it's it has to do with, I think, the nature of textbook publishing and the money involved in some of these enterprises. So
Yeah, there's a market. We've talked a lot about politics, but there's also a market for this and money to be made and things like that. So that's a whole other factor in why certain books sell the way they do. Or I was even thinking of why certain history becomes hot at certain periods, because at a certain point that history becomes marketable, and those books are going to sell, whereas maybe they were written a while ago, but people didn't think they were going to sell, so didn't put them on the shelves or didn't attract the attention that maybe the historian writing that wanted to attract. Because the market, I don't know anything about economics, so I will not go on at length, but there are market forces at work here. We've been chatting for about an hour. There's still a number of questions and comments on our Facebook feed. I'm just going to see if I can grab one or two of them, and I think they're related. One person brings up the idea that, is it a problem with history itself that so much of it is interpretation? since the 1776 report, the 1619 project, these are interpretations to an extent of history, and so much of what shows up in a textbook or what shows up in a historical monograph or whatever is an interpretation. Is that a problem with how history is a field in the first place? And then there's a question, I guess, related to that, which says, why did it take so long for white historians to start talking about Black history and Native American history? Can you address this? So I'm kind of shoving a lot of questions out there. But should we worry as people who teach history that history is an interpretation? I mean, Ms. Thomas, do you confront this? Are you allowed to talk about this in the classroom with your students about, you've mentioned different opinions and being able to agree to disagree. Does that mean that, is that how you handle different interpretations of the same history that you confront?
For the most part, because again, I have to, I approach history with the mindset, no one thinks like I do. So even with the students, okay, their opinions, everybody's not going to have the same opinion. So again, your mindset, your ideology, how you interpret, an event that happened in this country plays, is a huge factor. And what is how it come across or how it's being presented. So with me, with students, and I do have those that kind of they'll just shout their opinion out there. And again, I don't reprimand them because it goes back to that is their opinion. That is how they see the situation. But at the same time, again, I got to put a cap. I must put a cap on that conversation. And I have to redirect, that student again back to that is a conversation that you have, with your parents. So I must, deflect usually to, get them, again, so you all can discuss this, with your parents. It goes back to, again, in the classroom, what is allowed, what is not, allowed. And at times those students do push the envelope. I don't censor them for it. That's what I want. That's what they should be able to do. That's what I want to see more of. I don't think there should be a constraint, especially when it comes to history. There should not be a constraint to where or a suppression of certain facts or, certain parts of our history. So again, for me, it's like a waiting game. What can be, taught or discussed in the classroom. And we have said it all, it is very politicized, to the point that we're having this conversation now. That's how politicized it has gotten because look at where we're at now. So hopefully we'll get past that point.
Yes.
Julia, I just want to address, those are really good questions that those people on Facebook asked. And
Yeah.
I'm just going to take a quick stab at them. I think go with the last one first. I think it's taken historians a very long time to start looking at just not only African American history, but let's say Native American history, women's history, because when it became a profession to be a historian, the idea was that history was about politics. It was about the nation state. And so that's what people looked toward. And were there African Americans or other minorities, in government? No, right? So that's not what people were looking for. Were women in government in the late 19th century? No. And so that's one of the reasons that it's taken so long. And it's only been, since people have started to become interested in the mid 20th century, when people started to become interested in different types of history, right? Social history, about, history that didn't have to do with governments or politics, that people really started, taking a look at other experiences and then put that together with the social movements and of the 19th 1960s, those two things coincided. And I would say to the person who asked about interpretation, yes, without interpretation, all you're left with is a timeline. So I don't think we want to just give our students a timeline and say, here's history, right? Anytime you try to link together a fact with another fact with another fact and another event and a cause and an effect, you are left with an interpretation. And I think that's a good thing, because that's where if we don't, I think we all look for meaning in history. Like, why did this happen? Why was it caused? What does this say about where our country was at this time? And that's what makes history compelling, right? What makes it valuable to study. And so, yes, history is always going to be interpretive, not only because it's done by humans who have their own biases and it determines what questions that we as historians ask, right? And that's going to determine what questions we answer with those facts, right? But so that's my quick answer. Well, not so quick answer to both those questions.
Okay, great. Well, I know that kept us over time. Thank you for those who've been with us up through this point. I'm just going to end with I just want to address one last question. It's oh boy, and there are more questions, but I'm going to suggest this because I know that I don't want to tax anyone's patience or I don't know, we don't want the program to go on too long. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to ask if Anne and Judy and Ms. Thomas, if you all wouldn't mind looking at the actual Facebook feed once we conclude the program and just seeing if there are a few outstanding questions that maybe you'd like to address, take this opportunity to address, because I think this has been a wonderful program in that we've had a chance to talk to some of those members of the public, although I hate that phrase, non-historians, but who are interested in history and who care about how history is taught and who care about what that history is pointing towards and who care about whose histories are being part of the narrative and whose histories are being left out of the narrative. And it's fabulous that so many people are concerned about that. And I highly recommend that you can email me and you can ask me, you can email me at you can email me at Humanities .msstate.edu, and I can get you in touch with any of our presenters here. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk with you more. But let me just get to that last question. One person asks about training history teachers to make sure that they're very knowledgeable about what they teach. And Ms. Thomas, I get very much the impression from hearing you speak that you are quite knowledgeable about what you teach, that you have a lot of limits on what you're allowed to teach, limits that are given to you by the state and by the school district.
Yes.
So I kind of would like to rephrase that question, and this might be a good way to end, is how can we retrain politicians about what we teach, what we should teach? If so much of what is taught is directed from above, how do we reach the people above and remind them about history or teach them the history we want them to know? Any thoughts?
I think that's going to be really hard right now, especially because there is this interesting divide where a lot of politicians think of, and at least in our state, tend to think of academics as trying to undermine not just a historical narrative, but actual values, right? And I think this is what the 1776 report points to. And so I think that's gonna be hard. And it's hard for them to give up control of what's going on in the classroom at the K through 12 level, right? Because they want to see their values inculcated to students. And so when the histories don't seem to align with the values of the majority of the politicians, and at least this bill didn't make it out of committee, right? So there is hope. I mean, it's not that and there are lots of politicians in Jackson that do want probably a more inclusive representative history. So but I think that's always going to be an issue.
And I think too, as Anne suggested earlier, ultimately, we're trying to teach from we're not just making things up in the classroom. We're teaching from real legitimate sources. So we're using real documents where students can read those documents and see what people of the time actually said about what was happening. We're using maybe material culture, like that's one of the things the 1619 project has a nice sort of exhibit of material culture images that again ask students to interpret something real, something tangible, you know, the shackles that an enslaved person wore as like a tangible material reality of what it meant to be enslaved. And I think sometimes using some of those evidence-based, document-based, like actual evidence in the classroom means that to a certain extent, we can depoliticize some of what we're doing by sort of saying, look, here are the documents. I mean, one of the problems with the 1776 report is that it seems to stray significantly from any documents. And the reading of the Declaration of the Constitution is very, very limited. You know, I think if many people actually go and read the Declaration, they realize that there's the grand preamble and then it's a long laundry list of complaints against the king, you know, that most of us don't really even understand what they're about, you know, unless you're an early American historian. And the Constitution too. Today we think very much about the presidents, the presidency and the executive branch. But go back and read the Constitution, and what you very quickly notice is where do they spend most of their time? Article 1, Congress. And Article 1 is huge, huge, huge long. You know, Article 2 on the executive branch, much smaller. Article 3 on the judicial branch, very small. So just having people read documents and then asking them about, well, what do you notice? What patterns do you notice here? I think can get them thinking in ways that are not so politically minded and really start to engage with the evidence and then make some independent decisions that are not so politically loaded.
Great. Well, on the sources, I've always known that it was #1 rule in teaching history is go back to the sources, get the students in touch with the primary sources. So someone is clearly trying to get in touch with me on the phone. So I will just end our program. I'll say thank you so much to our presenters. Sorry about that. I really appreciate you being here with me today. And thank you very much to all of those of you who asked your questions on Facebook. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.